What is the Bible? What's the Bible? It's God's Word. What else is it? What is it physically? It's a book. It's a book. A lot of times we don't look at it like it's a piece of literature, but it is. It's different than other literature, but it's a book. So if it's a book, then it's something we can study and we can learn from, as well as physically as well as spiritually. And what I'm trying to get us through as we're working through this is how to study the Bible and how to approach studying the Bible. Because most of the time, our Bible study, if we have a disciplined Bible study, 9 times out of 10 is because we have a Sunday school book or we have something like that we use to study it. And normally we don't think about how to do it otherwise. But there's ways that you can approach studying the Bible without having to go through a particular curriculum. And I wanted us to look at how we can do that and how we approach studying the Bible and how's the best way and where's the best place to read at particular times and so on. And we started out with, I said the best book to start with is the book of John. And we talked about why reading the book of John and so on. And as we've talked through the different weeks and the different things we've discussed about the Bible and about what it is and the fact that we can trust the Bible, trust what it says, and trust that it's as a form of literature, that it has a lot of proof text for us to know that what we're reading today is what was written back thousands of years ago. So today, or this evening, I want to look at a different question. We talked about once you've read the book of John, where do you go from there? And the proposition that I laid out was that it depends on what you want to find out. What do you want to know? What questions come to mind when you read the book of John? And if you've never read the Bible before and you read the book of John, there's going to be a lot of questions that you have, because there's a lot there that opens up a lot of different avenues. But this evening, what I want to look at is where to look in the Bible for comfort. If you need comfort, where would you look in the Bible? Psalms, okay. Where else? For comfort in particular. There's a section of the Bible that I didn't pass out any sheets here tonight, but there's a section in the Bible that's called the writings or poetry books, and it is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. If you take a Bible, and I think this just happened, so I don't think it was planned this way. If you'll take most any Bible and hold it like this and go to about halfway and open it up, you're going to be somewhere around Psalms, Proverbs. You're going to be in this section of the Bible. And I think that's it's good that it's that way, because you can open up the Bible. If you just opened up the Bible and you opened up in the book of Exodus, and you're about halfway through the book of Exodus, and you'd never read the book of Exodus, would you know what was going on? I wouldn't have any idea. But you can go to the book of Psalms, Proverbs, you can go to this section of the Bible, and you can get comfort, you can get wisdom, you can get understanding. There's things at any time you can go. You don't have to follow these because they don't necessarily follow a particular historical time frame like many other parts of the Bible do. Like we talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, reading about the life of Jesus. And it goes through the life of Jesus from the time he was born until the time he was died and was crucified, resurrected, and ascended up into heaven. So we have that story form, but in these books we have something different. So I want to look at these 5 books, and I want to look at something in particular about each one of them to get us an idea of what we can use these for and how we can use these in our study. Job. When you think about the book of Job, is it a comforting book? Why not? He suffered a lot. Okay. How long did he suffer? Well, think about this. How old was Job when he died? How long had Job lived before he had his time of problems? How long did he live after that? Now, all these things there's a reason I'm asking these questions, and it'll hopefully we'll see something out of it. So I'm going to start with Job, first chapter, first verse. It says, "There was a man in the country of Uz named Job. He was a man of perfect integrity who feared God and turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His estate included 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large number of servants. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East." So he was the richest man anywhere around. How long was he the richest man in the land before he lost it all? We'll get to that in just a minute. And there's a reason I'm asking. In what way is Job different than the other books included in the writings, in this section in the writings? Do you know? If not, I'm going to tell you. The biggest difference is the entire book is the story about one man and about an incident that happened in his life, is what this whole book is. Proverbs, if you just open up the book of, or we'll say Psalms, because more of us read Psalms than we do Proverbs. We'd rather be comforted than to be smart and learn wisdom. So, but anyway, you can open up anywhere in the book of Psalms and read Psalms and be comforted and learn something, and it can be helpful to you. In the book of Job, you really need to start at the beginning of the book and read through it like you're reading a story of anyone's life. In order to get the gist of what's going on there. And let me ask you this before we even get into it. What is a lesson that you can learn from Job, from the life of Job? Patience, faith, patience and faith. You can learn this from Job. Do you want to learn it the way he did? No. People say, I want to make my own mistakes. No, I want to learn from other people's mistakes. I want other people to make mistakes, and I learn from them. I don't want to have to learn from my own. It's kind of tough. And I put down a general theme of each one of them. Job, the story is concerning a specific incident in one specific period in one man's life. The book of Psalms is a collection of poems and or songs. Proverbs is a collection of wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes is also considered wisdom literature. And Song of Solomon or Song of Songs is a single poem with a rather erotic nature. People try to make more out of the book of Song of Solomon than what it is. Well, it really has this deep meaning. It has this deep meaning. And a lot of times we miss what it says because we're looking for some deep meaning instead of reading what it actually says. When did Job live on the earth? I got it down here. Estimated around the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or into the time of Joseph, beginning around 2100 BC, probably about 1500 BC. That was a long time ago. How long was Job's period of suffering? Okay, that's what we're going to get at now. Job 2:13, it says, "Then they sat on the ground with him 7 days and nights, but no one spoke a word to him because they saw that his suffering was very intense." Now, who's it talking about here? Some of his friends came to visit him. And the friends, it says they came and sat with him. He was sitting here, and he had broken out in sores. He had lost all of his children. He lost all of his livestock. He had lost everything that he had except for a nagging wife. He kept the nagging wife. And the reason I say nagging wife is because she did nag him. So why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, that's some encouragement, isn't it? Isn't that the kind of encouragement you'd like to get from a mate? But the only thing he was left with was a nagging wife. But he lost all of his children, lost all of his livestock, lost everything that he had, and was sitting there. He had broken out in sores from head to toe, and he was sitting there, and some of his friends came up. A group of his friends came up, and they sat with him for 7 days and 7 nights and didn't say a word. Now, there's a lot of people that criticize these friends because these friends started making accusations that weren't necessarily true once they did start talking. Do you have a friend that's a good enough friend, if they were suffering, you would just go sit with them for 7 days and 7 nights? Solid. They're pretty good friends to do that. Well, the only reason I'm bringing this up is because we know his time of suffering was at least a week, because they were there for 7 days and 7 nights, and he was still suffering. Scripture did not tell us how long this period of time was. It's estimated anywhere from a few days to 2.5, 3 years. And people have different reasons for thinking about how long at the time it was and how they proposed that these dates were. I don't think it was 2.5, 3 years personally. I think it was much shorter than that, but we don't know. We don't really know how long it was, but we know it wasn't a long period of time because we've read the whole story, or if we've read the whole story. Job 42:16, at the end of Job, it says, Job lived 140 years after this and saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. Then Job died old and full of days. So how many years did he die after his time of trial? 140 years. How many of you plan to live to be 140 years old? But he lived 140 years after that. So when we think of Job, what do we think about? We think about suffering and pain and agony and loss. He lived 140 years with more wealth than he ever had before, had a bunch more kids, still had the same nagging wife. But he lived 140 years like that. Now, even if it was 3 years that he suffered, compare that to 140 years. It does. As you go through it, I won't go through it in detail because it tells each one, like they had a party where all the kids are all in one house, and I think it was a storm came and blew the house down and killed all of them, and then people came and stole all of his livestock. So in other words, it goes through the story as you read, and it tells how he lost his livestock, how he lost his children, how he lost all of it. And so it gives us the details of how it happened to him. But the thing I want us to focus on for just a minute is he had a time of suffering that was horrible. He lived 140 years afterwards in a time of blessing. But when we think about Job, what's the thing we think about? That little short period of time when he suffered. We don't think of the 140 years. How old was he when he got to that point? Well, he had 10 children that were grown. He had to be more than 20. I'm kicking something over here. I had to be careful. Job would have lived about 200 years. So in other words, if you figure about the 200 years away from the 140 years, that's about 60 years. Even if you said 3 years of suffering, that was 3 years out of all that. So if he was 57 when he had his time of suffering, then he was 60 when he started gaining it all back, and he lived to be 140. So how many years altogether would he have lived in a time of prosperity and happiness and fulfillment? Close to 200 years. That's a long time to be living. But what do we think of? Back up again. What do we think of? What comes to our mind first? I've heard people say, I'm as poor as Job's turkey. I don't know what in the world that means. But people make statements like that. I'm as poor as Job. I'm as poor as Job's off ox. I've heard people say that. How poor was Job's ox? How poor was his turkey, if he had any turkeys? How poor was he for almost 200 years? He was the wealthiest man in the land for almost 200 years. But all we think about is that time of suffering. But it can teach us something if we go through that and look at what he went through and how he got through it and what was accomplished in it. 42:12 says, so the Lord blessed the last part of Job's life more than the first. He owned 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. That's the same number he had to start with. Of course, he didn't get the others back, but he was blessed again after that, and he had even more than he started with. He was the wealthiest man in the land before all this occurred, and then afterwards he had it all back. So when you follow the story, so the book of Job should bring us comfort, should bring us solace in the fact that God is faithful, and he was faithful to Job. During the middle of it, Job would have just as soon have died, I'm quite sure. He'd be glad to have been rid of it. But for the vast majority of his life, he lived a good life. Wealthiest man anywhere around, had children. When you think of Job, do you think of how blessed he was, or do you think about how horrible things that had happened to him? He spent a lot of his life blessed and not cursed. So when you're reading the book of Job, in the writings, that section of Scripture, remember all those are written in there, not necessarily in a particular historical time frame, but they're written in such a way so that we can learn something from it and bring comfort and peace to us in the process. So, can the book of Job be a comfort? Yes, it definitely can, and it should be. That should be the first thing we think about, and instead, because we're human, what do we think about? We think about the bad part. Not the good part, not the good things. That we don't think about the faithfulness of God. The first thing we think about is poor old Job. Poor old Job. And bad things happened to him. That's true. But that wasn't the purpose of the story. What was the purpose in the story, do you think? He never lost his faith. Perseverance. What else? God restored everything he had and then some. God blessed him in all of that. Now, move to the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is a different animal altogether. Who wrote the book of Psalms? Pardon me? David. Okay. Anybody else? Psalms and Psalter come from the Septuagint, the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Old Testament, where they originally referred to stringed instruments such as a harp, lyre, or lute, then to songs sung with their accompaniment. The traditional Hebrew title is I'm not real good at Hebrew, but Tehillim is the way I would say it, but I'm not Jewish, meaning praises and many others, and then it also, which means prayers. So it's talking about praises and prayers is what the Hebrew is, where it comes from, and we get the name psalm or psalms from, or psalter, from the instruments that they played more so than anything else. And if you're wondering what they look like, that's what a lyre and a lute looks like. A harp, you know what a harp looks like. Everybody knows what a harp looks like. Well, anyway, that's a lyre, and that's a lute. And so they get them from those. Of the 150 psalms, only 34 lack superscriptions of any kind. Only 17 in the Septuagint, the pre-Christian translation of the Old Testament. These so-called orphan psalms are found mainly in the book to tell you which one they are in. And go down to the bottom, it says, and it says only a few lack titles. In other words, when it's talking about the superscriptions, if you read, some Bibles have this and some don't. It's a Psalm of David, and it tells how it's to be sung, or how it's to be done, and who's supposed to do what, and so on. In other words, it's instructions at the first of the psalm, and a lot of them from way back have these superscriptions. Now, whether that was there originally or it was added afterwards, we don't know. The interesting thing is, and the theory that is most commonly understood, is that the psalms were sung. When they would have a service or get together or whatever, they would sing the psalms. Some of the psalms have been put to music in our modern day. The contents of the superscription vary. In other words, it tells author, name, or collection, type of psalm, musical notations, liturgical notations, and brief indications of occasions or composition. In other words, it tells you something about the psalm. Students of the Psalms are not agreed on the antiquity or reliability of the superscriptions. In other words, people who have studied the Psalms are not all that sure about which ones of them were original and which ones of them were not. The ones that says a Psalm of David, what do they mean by that? Does that mean it's a Psalm that David wrote or a Psalm that David found that he added to his collection? What does it mean when it says a Psalm of David? And we don't know for sure. On the other hand, comparison between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text shows that the content of some titles are still subject to change well into the post-exilic period. In other words, the period after the exile, when they came back from exile in Persia. So it's still not understood completely, and people not agreed upon that. Does that mean we can't enjoy it? So who wrote the Psalms? It's evident that David wrote some of them and probably was responsible for collecting a good many of them, and because, well, what did they send for Saul? I mean, what did Saul send to David to have him to do when he would have an evil spirit come upon him? Have him to play music. Had music because it kind of soothed him and made him where he wasn't so hard to get along with. So if Diana turns on music, I know I'm being a pain, so she wants to kind of soothe me a little bit. But anyway, so we can read Psalm 1. I just picked it because it's the first one. Says, how happy is the man who does not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path of sinners, or join a group of mockers. Instead, his delight is in the Lord's instruction. He meditates on it day and night. He is like a tree planted beside the streams of water that bears its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. The wicked are not like this. Instead, they are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not survive the judgment, and sinners will not be in the community of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to ruin. Do you have to know anything about the history of that for that to say something to you? Do you have to know who wrote it for that to say something to you? Do you have to know the circumstances under which that was written for it to say something to you? Now, there's some of the Psalms that it helps to know what was going on in David's life when this particular Psalm was penned, because it has something to do with something that was happening in his life. But this particular one does not, so far as I know. But you can get some comfort for this regardless if you know anything about the Bible or not. If you turn to the book of Psalms, you read the first Psalm, you can be comforted by that. Since the Psalms are written as individual poetry or prose, we can select one at random and find comfort or wisdom. They do not necessarily follow a storyline from one to the next like Job did. It's not following a particular set order in the way it's put together. So you can read them at any time. You can go to the 150th one and read it just as easily as you could the 50th one or the first one, and you could get something out of either one of them without ever reading the others. But if you got in the middle of Job and you were reading that story, it wouldn't make much sense if you hadn't read the first part of the story. So again, the difference between Job and Psalms and some of the others we're going to talk about is the fact that it was written as a story. Proverbs. Authors. Although the book begins with the title ascribing the Proverbs to Solomon, when you're naming the books of the Bible, this is just an aside here. When you're going through the Bible and you try to remember which is first, Psalms or Proverbs, just remember who was first, David or his son Solomon. Because the Psalms are attributed to David, and Proverbs are attributed to Solomon, so you can remember which order they're in. It is clear from latter chapters that he was not the only author of the book. Proverbs 22:17 refers to the sayings of the wise, and 24:23 mentions additional sayings of the wise. So in other words, this is wisdom teaching, where we had the other, which is comfort and things that can comfort us, and we can learn things from it as well in the book of Psalms. In the book of Proverbs, there's wisdom there. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Which is one of my favorite passages in Proverbs. But you can learn wisdom from that. Could we use wisdom in our society today? Is there a lack of wisdom in our society today? Yes. Proverbs is the 20th book of the Bible. It falls under the category of wisdom literature in the Old Testament, preceded by Psalms and followed by Ecclesiastes. A proverb is a short saying that expresses a universal truth for practical, righteous living. So it has a purpose, and when you're reading in the book of Proverbs, you can get wisdom for it. And trust me, I should read some Proverbs every day if it'll give me wisdom, because I could use a little here and there. Proverbs 3:1. My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands, for they will bring you many days, a full life, and well-being. Never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Then you will find favor and high regard in the sight of God and man. That's wisdom, is it not? Is that not good instructions for anybody at any time? And you can read those instructions at any time and receive wisdom from it. So you can pick them anywhere you want to. You can open up any place in the book of Proverbs and you can find wisdom. You can pick a chapter in the middle of the book of Proverbs and pick a verse right in the middle of it, and you can get wisdom from it. So it's not a continuous story is what I'm getting at, but it's one of the books that you can really go to when you want to get wisdom. So you get comfort from it. This is just a rule of thumb for me. You get comfort from the book of Psalms. You get wisdom from the book of Proverbs. That's not 100% true, but it's close enough. You can pick up the book of Proverbs, turn to any point, and find wisdom and instruction. Like the Psalms, and it says the same thing. It does not tell a particular story. It's more of sayings and poems and poetry. Does anybody in here like poetry in general? I don't care much for poetry myself. Prose is worse because that's poetry without rhyming. So, but it's well, a lot of it doesn't. But I'm not particularly fond of poetry myself, but there's some wisdom to be had. And what gets me is you'll have a poem, and you read this poem, and they say this poem means, and it'll tell you all these things it means. I'll go back and look at it, and I think, I don't know. That's just like abstract art. Well, this means this, this, and this, and you can see that he was going through a time of, all I see is a bunch of lines and colors and streaks, and I don't see all that stuff that you're talking about. Ecclesiastes. How many of you know anything about the book of Ecclesiastes? Well, how many of you have read the book of Ecclesiastes this past week? It's not a book you really turn to read. People will turn to the Psalms to read quicker than they will the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book of wisdom as well. It's called wisdom literature as well. But it's a little bit different than the book of Proverbs. The title Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly, so it makes sense that the author identified himself in Ecclesiastes 1:1 by the Hebrew word that is translated into English as preacher, teacher, lecturer, etc., that type of thing. Evidence, if you've ever wanted to know why it's called Ecclesiastes, now you know. So you can write that down as something new you've learned today if you didn't know that to start with. Evidence in the book, along with most Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests that King Solomon authored Ecclesiastes. Can anybody tell me anything about Ecclesiastes right off the top of your head? There you go. When I read, I can't help it when I talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm reminded of my brother Jerry Williams out at Bethlehem Church when I was a little fella, and we had a revival speaker, and he preached out of the book of Ecclesiastes. He said there's a time for this and there's a time for that, there's a time for this and there's a time for that, and he went overtime. And Brother Jerry said there's a time to shut up too. so he said, yep, There's a time to shut up. So there's a time for everything. Chuck Swindoll, this is a quote of his. As king, he had the opportunity and resources to pursue the rewards of wisdom, pleasure, and work in and of themselves. Yet, the world-weary tone of the writing suggests that late in life, he looked back on his folly with regret, pointing us to a better, simpler life lived in light of God's direction. I think that's a good summation of what we're talking about there, because as you're reading through Ecclesiastes to start with, you think there's nothing new under the sun. I've done this, and it's not really worth anything, and this is not any good, and I've had this, and I've had that, and it's not anything. So if you don't read all of Ecclesiastes, you're going to feel down. Because he's talking, and think about it. How much wealth does it take to make somebody happy? How many parties would it take to make somebody happy? How many of anything in this world would it take to make somebody happy? People are always talking about today, I just want to be happy. Well, you're going about it the wrong way. It takes a lot more than that. Just being, if your goal in life is to be happy, that's a shallow goal. You want something that's gold. Maybe that's sort of, well, I should have said it, because a lot of people look at the gold as a way to get happy. Have you ever seen a more miserable group of people than the people in Hollywood? Though I'm always amazed how they can write this beautiful love song, but yet their love life is in shambles. It's terrible. But they write these beautiful words. I think, where in the world are they getting these words? My point is, fame, wealth, none of that can bring you happiness. Can you be happy with it or without it? Yes. Does it hurt to have some of it? What's the saying? It said, money can't buy happiness, but it can make a pretty good down payment. You can have more expensive misery, I guess. But there's always something out there that you're looking for that can make you happy if you're looking for something to make you happy. My grandma Roogie, this is her saying, and I remember it from the time I don't know where she got it or she made it up herself. She said, if you have to go looking for happiness, you'll never find it. And that is so true. Ecclesiastes presents us a naturalistic vision of life, one that sees life from distinctively human eyes, but ultimately recognizes the rule and reign of God in the world. This more humanistic quality has made the book especially popular among younger audiences. This is something that, as you look at it and you can see how distinctly through human eyes, everything. Think about it. What did Solomon have access to? How many wives did he have? He had 300 wives and 700 concubines. And a concubine is a lesser wife. But it says like, 1,000 wives. And they said he was a wise man. He was, that's idiotic to want to have 1,000 wives. I'm sorry. That's not something I'd want. But he could have anything and everything he wanted. Okay, let's look at it from a different perspective. What kind of air conditioner unit did he have in his palace? How about indoor plumbing? How about, so we can look at all these things. He could have anything and everything of his day. He could have the best of everything. He had rooms, if you read through his life and about what happened with him, he had rooms that were filled with gold. How many rooms do you have filled with gold at your house? If Diana has one filled with gold, she's hidden it from me. Of course, she's more valuable than gold, so I've got plenty of gold at my house. So. Valentine's Day was just a couple of days ago. I didn't get her anything, so I'm trying to make up. She told, years ago, I used to buy different things at Valentine's Day, and one year she said, why don't you just get me chocolate? The heck with all the rest of this other stuff. I was trying to be romantic. She says, give me some chocolate. So anyway, joy to her is chocolate. And I'm pretty much the same way. give you, give you some tools, give you something to work with. Don't get you, rule of thumb, Tommy, don't buy Edna a vacuum cleaner for Valentine's Day. You'd be a little more thoughtful than that. All right. He knew what you see. He had inside track. He knew what you wanted. Joy comes in different forms for different people at different times. But anyway, we're looking at Ecclesiastes. When you're reading through it, as you follow through it, really it's a book you need to follow completely through. If you just read bits and pieces here and there of Ecclesiastes, you're not going to get the whole story. You have to read through the whole thing and see what he comes up with. And as you're walking through it and you're reading through this, there's nothing new under the sun. There's a time for this, there's a time for that. But there's really nothing new. There's nothing that important here on this world on its own. Ecclesiastes follows a continuum that moves along a narrative and is thus difficult to pick up and just read anywhere for comfort and wisdom. The first of the book will lead us to believe that everything is worthless and life is not worth living. If you stop there, you can become depressed. But as you read on, he begins to give some bits of wisdom and encouragement and ends with, "But beyond these, my son, be warned. There's no end to the making of many books, and much study wearies the body. When all has been heard, the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commands, because this is for all humanity. For God will bring every act to judgment, including every hidden thing, whether good or evil." So he winds up at a good place, but he didn't start there. But you have to read the whole thing. Song of Solomon. What do you know about Song of Solomon? I've got Song of Songs in parentheses for a reason. This is not one that we read a lot, and there's reasons for it, and people argue over what it means. I think it means pretty much what it says, if you don't know the truth about it. Song of Solomon takes its title from the first verse of the book, which mentions who the song comes from. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. In Song of Solomon 1:1. And that's the reason I put Song of Songs, because that's initially what, I think it's still referred to that in the Hebrew Bible. The original Hebrew version of the book took its title from the book's first two words, and you all can pronounce it if you want to. Usually translated as Song of Songs. You can't speak Hebrew unless you kind of like you're coughing up something. But I'm not making fun of the language, Hebrew language, but it's tough sometimes. Song of Solomon 1:1. Solomon's finest song. Now listen to what it said here. "Oh, that he would kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. For your love is more delightful than wine. The fragrance of your perfume is intoxicating. Your name is perfume poured out. No wonder young women adore you. Take me with you. Let us hurry. Oh, that the king would bring me to his chambers." That's appropriate for Valentine's Day, I guess. We just came through. But you're thinking now, why is that in the Bible? And that's the reason people are tried to find some kind of deep meaning that has to do with who God is and who Jesus is. I don't think any of that. I think it's a writing. As you follow through it, it tells you about the relationship. I don't know how early this was in Solomon's life and how far this went through his life. But as he married more and more and more and more wives, I'm not sure which one he'd call his beloved. But anyway, all of the ones he married was not because he loved the women. It was because he was making alliances with other kingdoms and so on. And so the king would marry. And I'm glad we don't have those customs today, that you had to marry the king's daughter in order to make an alliance with the king. It didn't matter if you already had another wife. You make an alliance with another king, and he has a daughter, you got to marry his daughter as well. So anyway, that's not a practice I want us to hang on to. But as you read this, you can follow through and realize God created romance. didn't he? He created love. He created the intimate relationship between men and women. It's not something that shocked God. He's not surprised about any of this. He's not surprised at Valentine's Day that people are out buying stuff for their, I started to say their significant other, but I don't like to say that, for your wife or your husband, boyfriend or girlfriend, whatever the case may be. That doesn't surprise God at all. Who do you think invented all this? This book remains singular within the Old Testament for at least two reasons. Its character as a single poem, so this is one single poem, really, and its subject matter, particularly the frank discussion of love between a married couple. The Song of Solomon's willingness to broach the topic of physical love within the marriage has made many of its readers throughout history uncomfortable. Why do we in the church get uncomfortable with something God created? It's because Satan has polluted and made dirty what was not dirty. They have sex education classes in school. Is that where kids need to learn? Wouldn't it be better to learn from their parents or from their church or from Christian leaders or from godly people rather than just read from some generic teaching? I would think so. It's amazing to me, before they had sex education, people had children. For thousands of years, people have been having children. Big surprise. Rabbi Akiba, he had in as late as 90 A.D. at Jamnia, the Council of Jamnia, he had to argue to keep even then to keep the Song of Solomon in the Bible, because a lot of people said that and doesn't have any place in the Bible. Well, it certainly does. As a testament to the beauty of the marriage relationship in its fullness, Song of Solomon stands out with its uniquely detailed vision of this beautiful reality. It is evident that from this book, that the intimate relationship between a man and woman is not something dirty. Humanity has taken something beautiful and turned it into something vulgar. Have they ever? There are those who try to make this book allegorical and say that it is somehow descriptive of a relationship to God. I think that's a stretch. I think it's talking about the relationship between a man and a woman. I think it's before any couple gets married, I think they ought to do a study in the book of Song of Solomon. I think it would be a good idea to read it and read what it says and see the wisdom that's there. Each one of the books or the writings that we've talked about have a purpose and a place. When we understand that purpose, that position, that place, then we can better understand these books. We can understand the writings. We can understand what what the purpose of it is. Psalms, of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, all of them have benefit to us once we understand where they are in the Bible, why they're there, and what they're there for.